where does the nitrogen come from that the trees need for different stages of growth? Typically, we'll put a spring nitrogen out, either before bloom or a little bit after bloom, on the soil. The tree roots will take that up, and that'll promote the new spring growth. All the new shoot growth you see, new leaves coming out on that new shoot growth, that's all driven by the nitrogen, for the most part, being taken up by the soil. I need to get my water back there, so my voice keeps starting to crack. So, that's what drives the new shoot growth, and the majority of the leaves that you see out there in the orchard when you walk out there in May and June are all leaves that are driven from the nitrogen being taken up through the ground. And so you'll see nice big leaves if you've fertilized in the spring. You think, oh, my tree is doing great. You measure the nitrogen levels in July, like they always say, let's see how the tree's doing. It's after harvest. I really don't know why we do that in July. I think it's from other crops like apples. But the nitrogen levels look great in July. And then we started thinking about, cherry is not like apple. It blooms early, it ripens early. There's only about a 60 to 85 day period from bloom to ripening. And an awful lot of stuff happens right at the very first part of growth. You get bloom before the leaves even come out. The leaves come out kind of the same time as the blooms. And so we said, is the tree getting nitrogen for all that stuff that's happening at bloom and bud break and fruit set and early cell division? Is all that coming from the nitrogen that you're putting out on the soil, or is it coming from storage reserves in the tree? And the answer was it all comes from storage reserves. Jim Flory and a graduate student named Costanza Zavaloni back in the early 2000s did a study with labeled nitrogen, meaning they could track the nitrogen in the tree. And they showed that when you put soil nitrogen out, even if you put it out before bloom, the tree doesn't start to see that, doesn't start to take it up until about 3 or 4 weeks after bud break. Once the leaves come out, they start transpiring. That starts pulling water through the tree. Water starts moving into the root system, and nitrogen moves with that water into the roots, up through the transpiration stream and into the leaves and the growing points. So until you have leaves on the tree is not taking up any nitrogen. Certainly the soil is also cold at that point, so the roots aren't taking up a whole lot. So whether you put your soil application out before bud break or a week after bud break, the tree's not seeing it until 3 or 4 weeks after bud break. By that time, you've gone through bloom, you've gone through bud break, the spur leaves have all come out, fruit set has occurred. So all of that is being driven by the nitrogen that's stored in the tree from the previous growing season. So how do we optimize that nitrogen was a question we started to ask. And first we looked at, if we defoliated a tree, let's say from cherry leaf spot, the tree is defoliated prematurely in September, how did that affect the storage reserves of nitrogen? And we found that it cut that storage reserves by 40–50% sometimes if the tree defoliated prematurely. So we found it's very important to make sure the foliage on your tree stays nice and healthy up until it goes through natural leaf drop. First week of November, second week of November, whatever. That last bit of growing season, the tree is not necessarily taking up any more nitrogen, but when the leaves turn yellow, that is a sign that the nitrogen in the leaf is being remobilized back into the storage tissues of the tree. Especially the flower buds for next year is what we found. So when the leaves are turning yellow, the tree is essentially fertilizing itself for next spring's growth. If you lose those leaves prematurely, you've lost that natural tree refertilization. When the leaves are falling to the ground, they'll break down, they'll degrade. That nitrogen will still go in through the soil system, but it won't come out until next year. It's not going to be there in the reserves where you need it for spring activities. So that was the first thing that was really clear. Then we said, okay, if the tree is naturally fertilizing itself through leaf senescence, maybe we can put some foliar nitrogen on those leaves in October before it goes into full senescence, and that nitrogen that goes in through the leaf will be remobilized to the flower buds and those storage tissues, just like the rest of the nitrogen in the leaf is being remobilized. That way we thought we wouldn't stimulate growth in the fall that might make the tree less cold hardy. We were a little worried that if we fertilized on the ground, that nitrogen would be taken up in the way that the tree normally takes up for growth, and it might stimulate late season growth and make the tree less cold hardy. So that's why we went with the foliar application. I can't prove that that's not a good way to do it on the soil. I'm just saying why we did it through the foliage. because we didn't test the other part yet. So we found that yes, putting on a foliar urea spray, 2 worked better than 1, 3 worked about the same as 2. So we said 2 or 3 sprays starting in early October, running through October, maybe on weekly intervals. We were able to boost the nitrogen in the storage tissues by, I don't know, at least 30–40%. So we said, great, we're bumping that nitrogen up. It's right there in the storage tissues where the tree needs it. And it stays there all during the winter. We look to see if the nitrogen levels fluctuate at all during winter. Is any more nitrogen remobilized from elsewhere in the tree to the flower buds during winter? Or is any of that nitrogen that we pumped into the flower buds remobilized out during winter? And the answer is no. Once we hit winter, everything stays the same. Nothing's happening in that tree to speak of on a nitrogen basis. Come spring, then, you get more remobilization, and those buds have the nitrogen that you put in, plus they have nitrogen coming from the rest of the storage tissues. And actually, the nitrogen level doubles at the time of bud break. You go from about 2% to almost 4% in those expanding flowers and buds. So that was really good news. We've shown that we can get the nitrogen in. We measured leaf size the next spring, because what we were concerned about is the spur leaves. All the spur leaves, where most of your spur fruit is being grown, elongate in the first 2 to 3 weeks after bud break. So that's the same time that the tree is not taking nitrogen up. So spur leaves don't elongate beyond that first 3 weeks or so in the spring. So the biggest spur leaf you can possibly make is going to come from the nitrogen that's already in the tree. You're never going to change the size of spur leaves after 3 weeks after bud break. You'll change the size of the new shoot leaves, but you're not going to affect the spur leaves. So that's why we were really concerned about measuring that and seeing, okay, if we bump the nitrogen levels up in the fall, will it have an effect on our spur leaves? And in fact, it gave us up to 20% larger spur leaves. We were hoping that that would translate to bigger fruit size, but we didn't have enough of a controlled experiment to detect differences in fruit size come harvest. Differences in crop load, differences in pruning of the trees, our fruit size differences all washed out. So I can't say that the fall foliar has shown bigger fruit size. I can only say the nitrogen is there when you bloom, the nitrogen is there when you go through fruit set, the nitrogen is there when you go through cell division, and the nitrogen makes bigger spur leaves. All of that should give you bigger fruit, but I don't have the direct correlation to actual fruit size, just from difficulties of doing the experiments. So the last question that we asked then, after saying, this looks like a really good thing to do, certainly doesn't seem to hurt, unless it makes the tree less cold hardy. We didn't think it would because of going through the leaves, getting remobilized the way the tree was naturally doing, but we said, let's test that. So my master's student at the time, Theoharis Zounis from Greece, he put out foliar sprays not only in October, but he started August 31st and went from August 31st on through September and on through October at different times to see if even those early sprays would stimulate late fall growth and cause the trees to be not cold hardy or less cold hardy. So he put the applications out. He would cut shoots, bring them in. We have a programmable freezer that steps down the temperature, holds it for a couple of hours, and steps it down further. And every time at the end of a hold session, we take some branches out, and we'd evaluate them for cold damage. That's how you test for cold hardiness, and you figure out the temperature at which 50% of your samples show cold damage. LT50 is the technical term that we use. So we started comparing LT50s from the treatments that were put on August 31st and September 8th. It was 2 treatments, a repeat, 1 week later after the first one. Then middle of September, then late September, early October, and then mid-October and late October. So 4 different treatment periods, double treatments. And surprisingly, not only were all of the nitrogen samples not any less cold hardy than the untreated trees, the nitrogen-treated trees were more cold hardy than the untreated trees. So bumping up the nitrogen levels in those tissues, even as early as the beginning of September, when we froze those tissues, let's say 3 weeks later, the end of September, we had sometimes a 6 to 8 degree difference in those LT50s, meaning that we could, if we were to get a sudden weird Arctic blast that came down from Canada in mid-October and froze the leaves on the tree, it appeared that the trees that had the foliar nitrogen applied would have had no damage at the same temperature, could actually have survived temperatures up to 6 or 7 degrees, maybe even 8 degrees colder. So Nikki Rothwell repeated these experiments up at the Northwest Station, and on sweet cherry she found an increase in cold hardiness as well, and she actually made measurements on into February and found that that increased cold hardiness for the most part persisted even on into February. Our experiments only showed that the trees were getting cold acclimation earlier than a standard tree when they were treated with nitrogen, and that held on through December for leaf drop, but we didn't continue our measurements beyond that. Nikki showed that that cold hardiness effect even extended on into the middle and towards the later part of winter. So we're very positive about this idea of putting a foliar nitrogen out there to bump those reserves up from a fruiting point of view and from a tree health point of view.